Hi, I am so glad to be joining you today to talk about how do we do good work that lasts. And I'll be sharing some lessons that I have learned from my service in the social sector. So imagine yourself on a typical workday. You're sitting at your desk, and one of your colleagues says, "Hey, can you jump on the line real quick to talk to someone else?" And so you open up Zoom or whatever platform you're using, and much to your surprise, there's an FBI agent there who says, "If your changes go through, missions will fail." How do you react? You might think to yourself, "I really shouldn't have logged in today." But that's not the right response. So you take a deep breath and instead ask the agent, "Well, tell me more." Now, this was actually my reality on more than one occasion when I worked at the FBI. This particular scenario that I'm talking about here happened around the time one of the divisions that I was working in at the FBI was doing an organizational reorg, because, yes, the FBI has those too. Now, this particular project required a technology change and policy change and more, all in the names of helping agents and professional staff work better together. And now I had thought that I had done everything I was supposed to do for a large change project in an organization. I had done a lot of research, I thought, within the division. I'd gotten the sign off of the senior most executive who was sponsoring the project and led the division. He'd even held a large meeting to say that my changes were going to revolutionize the way we did business and lead to a better world. And we'd started that implementation process. And this, of course, is what led to the feedback, shall we call it, that I received from that agent that day. Now, fortunately, this project ended up working out, in large part because I invited the agent who had come in with that strong feedback to be a part of the solution and to be a part of helping me redesign and reimagine the process. And ultimately, the new way of doing business did become the norm. Now, why do I tell you this story? Is it because working at the FBI is cool? Well, yes, it definitely was a great experience for me. But it also reflects a lot of the challenges that we often encounter when we try to do some type of digital transformation project, some type of technology advancement project, certainly within government agencies and NGOs, but broadly as well. I since left the FBI and have gone on to work at the White House and at a think tank. I'm now at an NGO that does data science for other NGOs and government agencies all around the world. And I can tell you these challenges present themselves over and over and over again. And what I found is there's always a reason someone says no. Now, you may not have had an agent walk into your office and tell you missions will fail, but you've probably heard some version of a reason or excuse that people give as to why they don't want to move forward for a particular digital transformation project. But the mission, people might say, we just can't stop doing work to do that upgrade that you want, to roll out that new code that you want, to do whatever advancement that you want. Or, but the history. Things work well enough today. We don't need to break them further, even if they don't work perfectly today. Or one of my personal favorites, "I didn't break it. I shouldn't need to fix it. Go talk to someone else about that." Maybe you've been lucky that you haven't heard any of these as people have told you no for something, but my guess is you probably have. And so, what I found though is that when you're working on these digital transformation projects, what's really common is that there are a lot of starts and stops to these projects. There are a lot of changes to the plan and changes to the plan that happen. There's often the initial adoption and then the ultimate rejection or backsliding from the advancement that was done, the changes that had been rolled out, the code that had been rolled out as well. So we have to really ask ourselves, how can we do this work better? How can we do this work in ways that it will actually last and make an impact in organizations and for the clients and for the customers and for the communities that these tools serve? I've heard it say I've heard it said it's not about the technology, it's about the process, or it's not about the process, it's about the people, or it's not about the people, it's about something else. And I am here to tell you, I wholeheartedly disagree with all of those statements. It is absolutely about the technology, but it is also about the people and it is also about the process. You don't have to choose between technology and process in order to make an impact and in order to get things done in organizations. To successfully manage change, you need to make sure that you are pulling in the technology, the people, and the process into your change management, overall change management process. You're pulling them all in together in order to have successful, long lasting change management. So let's dive in a little deeper. We'll start with the technology piece. Now, I firmly believe that governments and NGOs deserve the best technology because if we are delivering services, if they are delivering services that we believe in, then we should believe that they should be managed in ways that matter, in ways that actually work. Now, best case scenario, when policies are designed, the technologists are at the table being part of that development process and making sure that the policies are being designed will actually work with the technology and with the technologist. Now, that doesn't always happen. Sometimes you're left trying to fix the delivery of services, and sometimes you're left just trying to work around the policies and figure out how you can actually implement any of them and get work done while still staying in line with those policies. It can be really challenging. But it's really important here, I think, in these situations to really focus on what the organization you're working for, what the work that you're doing is actually intended to do, is actually intended to help, and is actually intended to advance. And then you pick the most appropriate technology for that situation. You don't need to over design or under design. I think of one of my friends who was working in this space as well and found herself working in a crisis response situation. It was a quickly evolving situation involving a lot of people moving around, a lot of people who needed to find shelter, a lot of people who needed to find homes, and a lot of people who needed to find some sense of permanence. And because the work was moving so quickly, my friend said that she was going to just pull together a Google form and a Google spreadsheet for the shelter that she was partnering with to track all the people. That didn't sound quite right to me, but my friend assured me that things were moving so quickly. This is all that they had time to do. And so what ended up happening is that this worked out initially. But as there were more people, as the phase of the crisis response shifted, the Google form and Google spreadsheet were actually overwhelmed by the amount of traffic that they were getting, the decisions that needed to make, the number of concurrent users, and more. And ultimately, the shelter where my friend had partnered had to revert back to the way they were doing things before. And in addition to going back to a previous inefficient way of doing things, they also had to add on top of that a lot of manual transferring of data and a lot of manual moving of data between systems. So it ended up just being a lot of extra work. So what could we learn from this situation? In this particular crisis response case, my friend actually needed a database, probably a fairly simple database that could have been built and a tool to sit on top of that to help her manage the situation. And so what's important from this story, though, is to pick the right level of technology. Don't shortchange organizations or situations just because of time constraints or just because of some of the talent constraints that you might have, but really figure out what is most appropriate. At the same time, though, it's important to not overcorrect and declare yourself the technical expert of the day and then over design solutions for the partners that you're working with. At DataKind, we think a lot about what are the solutions that our partners can actually sustain after we leave, really designing with that end in mind. We said just in a meeting that I was in the other day, we would never develop a solution that required running from the command line if the partner that we're working with didn't actually have that talent on board that day, the day that we were going to actually deliver the technology. So really thinking through what is the appropriate use of technology, what is the appropriate technology for that specific situation. It's important to not overcompensate. And it's important to accurately assess the organization that you're delivering for, the reason that you're delivering for, and the talent that will be around to help sustain the work that you're developing as you are designing the technology and you are making those critical decisions and those critical trade-offs. And just to bring that home, as we think about, again, these guidelines for developing technology that's there, you want to make sure that you are bringing into these situations the true deep technical expertise that you have, that your team has, and that the organization needs. And then you are designing those appropriate and responsible solutions for that organization, for that client, for that community in that day, not some future state that they may hit 10 years from there, but really something they can adopt and run with for that day. And then finally, it's important to start investing in talent early. And if what you're doing touches government in any way, encourage your government partners to start the procurement process early, because otherwise you won't be able to get that talent in, you won't be able to get the technology in that you need. But really, to make this first piece of that trifecta that we've discussed stick, drive home these 3 points for the teams that you're working in and the teams that you've empowered to help manage through the change. So with that, let's go to the next piece, people. And many times as we're talking about managing these transformation projects, people management actually just comes down to change management, a solid change management process. So we're going to go back to basics here and talk about John Kotter's work and leading change, where he studied what executives need to, he studied what a lot of executives did, a lot of leaders did when leading change initiatives in their organization. He followed that up several years later with a work where they studied, where John Kotter and Dan Cohen studied the main problems that people come up with. And one of the main problems is speaking to people's feelings throughout change management processes. So as you think about managing change processes, it's important to think about what is the discipline, what are the steps that you need to go through to make sure that you can have a clearly defined change idea and change vision and more to navigate through that, but also that you're speaking to not just what needs to be done, but how it needs to be done. And you're addressing some of the emotional concerns that people have, even though oftentimes, especially in tech environments, they may not state them. So Kotter's put together the 8-step change model, and I think this is a great framework to use when thinking about how do we manage change and how do we manage people through change in organizations. Again, all in the context of some type of digital transformation or technology rollout, technology upgrade. Now, the 8 steps listed here, again, I believe are a strong framework. It's been a couple of decades since this framework was released. And so you could argue that maybe you switch around some of the steps, or I sometimes do a couple of these steps concurrently now as I think about managing change in my own organization. But these steps, creating urgency, forming a powerful coalition, creating a vision for change, communicating the vision, removing obstacles, creating short-term wins, building on the change, and then anchoring the changes in corporate culture are crucial to success of any type of digital transformation project. I want to dig deeper in just a couple of the, just in 4 steps of the 8-step model. So first, talking about forming a coalition. This is so crucial to any type of change you're doing, especially when you're dealing with technology, especially when you're dealing with different engineering teams. You really need to build a coalition because the work that needs to be done, first of all, there's strength in numbers, but secondly, it turns out that people hear information in different ways. And so by having a coalition, you also have different messengers for the information. When I think back to the FBI example that I gave earlier, for some individuals, I needed to send an agent to talk to another agent to get on board, or in other individuals respected more senior management, executive management, others respected their peers. And so really forming that coalition is crucial to having the right minds to help design the change that you're doing, but also then to be able to establish buy-in and to get buy-in from a large number of people. And when you think about establishing the coalition, you want to identify both people who are affected by the change that you're going to roll out and also who can affect, so who can greenlight, who can stop, or who will otherwise frustrate your life as you are doing these digital transformation projects. The second step that I wanted to highlight is creating a vision. So many times as you're working on rolling out new software, you're working on updating code, you're working on moving something to the cloud from whatever state that it was in before, the changes that you're doing are complex, they require a lot of steps. If you don't create a strong vision for people to buy into, if you don't create a strong vision that people can easily understand, they're not going to want to put in the time and effort required to help do that change and to help execute that change. So it's really important that when you create your vision that you paint for people to see, you also really simplify the complex so people can actually see how they play into it and see how this can positively impact their work lives. The third thing that I want to point out here is the importance of removing obstacles. If you're leading any type of certainly digital transformation project, you want to figure out how to remove obstacles from your team. Now, especially if you're working in the government sector or the NGO sector, you will need to develop a certain amount of tenacity here because you will hear no quite a lot. But it's really important then to think about, how do I help remove obstacles for my team? How do I have some of the tougher conversations? How do I make the process of doing work easier for the team? And so really doing that. And then finally, and this is one of the points that I emphasize so often to my teams, is it is important to really then build whatever change that you've done into the corporate culture. Now, mentioned that I worked at the FBI, which is rather bureaucratic, as you might imagine. I worked at the White House, also bureaucratic, but I previously worked at IBM, which I know also bureaucratic, and the organization you work at probably has its own level of bureaucracy. And what I like to think about bureaucracy, though, is to figure out ways to use bureaucracy for good. Because the reality is, if you decide to innovate outside of the process, you figure out how to make change outside of whatever processes are in place or whatever bureaucracy is in place, and then you leave, your change will leave with you and your change won't outlast you. And then essentially, you wasted a lot of time. So we want to leave a good legacy, which really means we need to understand the organizational culture. We need to understand the organizational systems that will be able to keep the work that you've done going on and on much longer after you ultimately move on from that position. And so from there, I want to talk about what's my favorite piece of the trifecta that I mentioned, which is process. Now, I know not everyone has the love of process that I have, and that's okay. I'm the type of person who, in a pre-COVID world for dinner parties, would start my dinner parties with an overview of the process that we were going to use that night, when conversation would happen, when food would be served, how you should put it together. And I would ask for feedback at the end of the night, because that's just who I am. But even if you don't have the love of process that I have, because really I want you to encourage you to think through, as you're rolling out your transformation projects, as you're upgrading the systems that you're using, as you're rolling out new solutions, to really think about what structure can you provide to your teams and to organizations so that it makes the process by which people do work easier. I like to say here, structure allows freedom. When people know how to get work done, they can spend less of their time thinking about, how do I get approvals from here? How do I figure out who to include in these conversations? And they can instead spend their time on actually innovating and coding well and coming up with things that actually matter. And so really here, defining clear processes for how to get the work done can really help advance the work that needs to be done and can help you be more successful in managing through that digital transformation that you so want to execute on. So one of the overarching things, though, that I want to leave you with is that even as you're thinking about, how do I do this technical change that I want to make happen? How do I think about pulling together members of this open source community, or pulling together members of my team or other teams or of the company overall that I'm working in? Really always think through, how does the overall mission of what you're doing impact the community? Now, community can vary. From my stance in sitting at an NGO that works with other NGO, community is often the people the NGOs serve. Community can be clients. Community can be partner organizations. Community can be potential customers. But really thinking through, as you're doing your work, what is the overall mission of what we're trying to do, and how does that impact the community? And that can then drive you to help center people in the work that needs to be done and remind people why it matters, and tie some of your vision statements from that change management that we talked about, to tie some of the trade-offs that you're making in technology decisions and design decisions that we've talked about, and to tie some of even the process for how you might intake requirements, for example, to the community that you're serving. So the work you're doing, again, ultimately matters and ultimately does do good work that you've intended. The final thing I want to leave you with as we talk about how do we make sure that the good work that you do lasts. I want to make sure that you really think about these last 3 points. Be intentional about who you put on your team. Look around the table and make sure your team doesn't all look like you. Have people of different races, genders, and strengths, and even professions at your table as you're designing solutions and you're thinking about how is this product overall going to look, or even how is this code overall going to function? What do we need to minimize? What do we need to emphasize? What bias do we need to take off? So be really intentional about who you put on your team. And then as you think about how you'll actually run that change process, really empower your team to do good work. I like to tell many members of my team, if I could do the work for you, I wouldn't need you. And so, really making sure that the people who are on your team are empowered to go off and to do the work that you want them to do and that they are qualified to do. Now, we can have a separate conversation about having unqualified members on your team, but in general, you really want to make sure that people are empowered to work within their strengths and that you, as the leader, can bring those strengths together to really deliver the best digital transformation solution that you can. And then finally, you want to support others by sharing what you learn. And yes, of course, this applies within your immediate team, but in open source communities and technical communities, it also means sharing what you've learned, how you've done the work, interesting code that you've written, anything else that you've learned with the broader community so that other people don't have to make the mistake that you have to make. I know, I think back to my college days when it was, if the code was difficult to write, it should be difficult to understand as to reasons people gave, perhaps myself included, as to why code was not documented well. But really going the other direction and really thinking through how do we as a broad technical community really make sure that we collectively are advancing our skills and advancing the impact we can all have together. And so when you think of all of that and you combine that with, again, managing together the technology piece, the people piece, and the process piece, you too can do great work that lasts. Thank you for your time.